Hello. This is the video for week 2 of our John course, and this week we're looking at John's prologue. So this is John chapter 1 verses 1 to 18. Now I ought to say by way of caveat, and this is definitely not me trying to get myself off the hook, or maybe it is, that it's almost impossible to do justice to John's prologue in the space of half an hour. It's probably not even possible to do justice to John's prologue in the space of an entire career. But nonetheless, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the skills, some of the issues, and some of the ideas that we need, I think, to interpret this prologue well. And what I'd like us to do is I'd like us to think about particularly what is it that we need to know in order to read well. Now, in terms of background to this session, hopefully you've had a chance to look at Professors Attridge and Bartlett in their conversation about the prologue of John, and I have to be perfectly honest with you, they're very, very good scholars, and so please do watch that. And also please do read John Ashton's essay, The Discovery of Wisdom. That's a very important article, and the content of both the video and the article supplemented, I hope, with a few observations by me in the space of the next 20 minutes or so, I think will be enough for us to have a good discussion on Wednesday when we meet. So I'm going to begin with a brief reading of John chapter 1 verses 1 to 18. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or the will of the flesh, or the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." So I'll just take that off the screen for a moment, and say one of the things that's terribly important for us as we read is to know the limitations of what it is that we're reading, and our English translations, superb though they are, sometimes in order to express an idea clearly, they might obscure features of the text which are interesting but not necessarily primary. You might see this in stylistic features. You might see this in features of the text which are evocative of ideas. And we'll see both in John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. You might also need to be aware of the way in which languages sometimes encode quite specialist knowledge, and not just specialist religious knowledge, but knowledge about the social world of the author and the readers. Also knowledge that would have been regarded as part of the ordinary repertoire of ideas that people just knew. And it's important for us to be aware of the ways in which the language used might evoke and invoke some of these things. When I read John's prologue, I tend to read John's prologue looking for a few different things. Firstly, I'm looking for the argument. Now, the argument is about the logical progression of ideas. I'm trying to understand what he's talking about. I do the same when I'm reading Paul. When I'm reading an argument, I'll try and work out what it is that he's saying and how what he's saying fits together like a skeleton. Sometimes it's good to actually draw out skeletons of an argument. So here, for instance, is I'll try and put this onto the screen. Here, for instance, is the logical structure of John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This, or he, was in the beginning with God. And you see here that this is basically a statement about the Word, which is further expanded, and then the expansions and the original statement are synthesized to prepare the ground for the next idea, which is in verse 2. So in the beginning was the Word. This was when the Word was. Now it's who the Word was, and it's where the Word was, and the Word was with God. And now it's what the Word was, and the Word was God. And then if you take the where and the when and put them together, you get some further explanation of the what. It introduces the idea that at the beginning, when there was only God, there was also the Word, and that this introduces plurality into the idea of the heavenly powers. And then the question in verse 2 is, what's the relationship between these heavenly powers? And verse 2 states this quite clearly. All things were made through him. And the through is important there. The through is important because the Father is the creator. The Word is the one through whom creation is created by the Father. And so this is all about making a bold statement about the Word, a bold series of statements, a synthetic statement, and then using that to inform what's to come. Now that's just a tiny bit of argument, and it's massively oversimplified, partly because we haven't explored what it is to mean, what it is for the Word to be with God. And we also haven't explored B2, the expansion, and the Word was God. And you'll notice there, I've put, notice the difference in word order. Greek is a language which is less dependent upon word order than English. And so for that reason, it actually reads, the text actually reads, and God was the Word. But of course, in English, we hear that as if God is the subject of the verb to be, whereas we're still talking about the Logos, about the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But in Greek, This is a perfectly permissible expression for the word was God. This particular part of this particular verse has been a source of some controversy over the centuries, and there are still some groups nowadays that think that a better translation would be "and the word was a God." Just to show you something, and this is just an aside, but that word, that letter there, just under the G of God, is an omicron. And when it's got that little comma thingy there called a breathing over it, it's the Greek word for the. Now, ordinarily, Jews would put a one of them in front of theos, God. So they didn't talk about God, they talked about the God. And what that meant, that was a way of identifying God proper, as opposed to a mere God, what we might use lowercase g. Now, you might say that the absence of that omicron indicates that we're talking about a God, and that actually what you're talking about is there's God and then there's a kind of subordinate God, the Word. And that's certainly how some groups like the Arians and the Jehovah's Witnesses have at various points taken this verse. But actually, when you're dealing with the Greek word verb to be, was here, and there's the translation of was, in, which is from the verb to be, eimi. The subject, if the words are out of order, then often Greeks will use an article to delineate which is the subject of the verb. And so the article here is left in for logos, because logos is the subject, and the article is removed from ho, theos, as a way of designating that theos is not the subject of this particular clause. Now, why does that matter? It's just a way of pointing out that that actually translation isn't the same as meaning. Grammar isn't the same as reading wisely, and that a text might present with multiple translation possibilities. And part of a wise reader is having an appropriate hinterland to be able to make a decision between the alternatives. And I think having the hinterland of knowing that Greeks would often use the article as a way of signalling which is the subject of a clause like this, when the words are out of order, that's very helpful, and that helps us to realise that John isn't saying that the word was a God, as in a subordinate God. I think as well, knowing that also helps us to understand why John said the word was God rather than the word was divine. There's another Greek word, theos. Theos, which is very similar to theos, but it has a little iota there, a Greek letter I there, and that's the word that's used for divine. But that can be quite confusing, because there were a class of heroic figures in the Greek myths called the divine men, who were demigods and semi-gods and semi-demigods and what have you. People like Hercules and Asclepius and people like that, sons of divinities by human women. And John uses theos very particularly as a way of avoiding that interpretation. And of course, that's another piece of background that grammar doesn't help us to know. And so, as much as I think a grammatical reading of an argument like John chapter 1 is important. The grammar can't displace the need for background. But in addition to that, there's also, I want to show you, there's also style and artifice. What do I mean by that? Well, texts aren't just purveyors of content. They're written in such a way to have rhythm and style. They're written to have tone, and they're written to have pace and tempo. They're written with alliteration or assonance or rhyme. There's all sorts of stylistic features, and not every culture has the same stylistic features. Here's one possible way of understanding John chapter 1 verse 1 stylistically, and we see here it's called a chiasm, and a chiasm is basically just a zigzag. It's a cross pattern. You go in to the middle and then out in a kind of mirror motion, like an hourglass. And you see at the beginning of the chiasm, you've got in the beginning, at level 1, was the Word, and He, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. And you see how there might be stylistic reasons why the evangelist John reversed the word order. He could, for instance, have said, I'll read this in Greek and then translate, Kai ho logos in pros ton theon, and the Word was with God. And he could have said, Kai ho logos in theos. He could have said that, but he didn't. So why did he change the order around? There's no difference in meaning because Greek has a flexible word order. Well, it's probably stylistic. It sounds better if you're used to chiastic structures. There you've got, and God was the Word, puts the two God statements together at the same point in the chiasm. Stylistically, if you're used to that pattern of expressing yourself, if you're used to that pattern of literary artifice, then that's something that you would tend to do almost by default. And so sometimes how we write and what we read is done, I don't know about you, it's done almost in the flow. It's done almost in the flow, and at that moment in the flow of writing, you write automatically. Not automatically, but in a way that isn't always fully aware of the way in which you might be following conventions that have been deeply ingrained in you because of all of the texts that you've read and all of the texts that you're familiar with. And those texts will be very culture specific, just as they would have been for the evangelist. And so here we've got John chapter 1 in a chiastic structure. It doesn't really add to the argument, because we've got what John's talking about in the previous slide, but it does add to the sense that the argument is that style is important for this argument. The prologue might well be, we talk about it as if it's prose, but also we talk about it in poetic terms. It sounds almost hymnic in some regards, and that's because it's got quite a high literary style. It's got quite a stylized way of expressing itself. Strophic is the word. It's almost versified. So we've looked at one one framework for thinking about the prologue of John. Let's have a think about it. And we've looked at another. So we've looked at argument, we've looked at style. But there's a lot that we need to know by way of background. Because we're talking about a text which is 2,000 years old. And perhaps the first thing to do is to look at some of the passages that John might have had in his mind, or in the back of his mind, or in his unconscious when he was writing this. And it's very difficult to get past the first two words, in the beginning. And of course in English that's 3 words, but in Greek, en arche is 2 words. And if I take you back just a page, there we go. En arche. En arche. Beginning of John chapter 1 verse 1. En arche. The beginning of Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And there we have, in the beginning God made the heavens and the earth. And almost certainly when John begins his gospel in the beginning, he's alluding back to Genesis chapter 1 verse 1. It's probably also worth bearing in mind that the rabbinic tradition, which translates the Hebrew Bereshit beginning as by wisdom. So I mention that because one of the big features of John is that the word in John's Gospel looks astonishingly similar in some respects to the figure of wisdom in the Old Testament. In my view, they are not identical. They just aren't. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So let's have a look at Proverbs chapter 8. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, creation imagery. When he made the firm skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep. These are all references to Genesis 1 verse 1. When he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was beside him, like a master worker. So, to paraphrase John, wisdom was there at the beginning, but the beginning of God's work, there's a real question about whether in the beginning in John is a much more absolute beginning than that. But anyway, nonetheless, wisdom is there at the beginning and is beside the Lord, with the Lord, and his helper in creation. We've got there ideas which are not dissimilar to the first 2 or 3 verses of the Gospel of John. There are some significant differences, and sometimes interpreters have tied themselves up in knots because they haven't noticed the differences as well as the similarities. And actually that brings me to an important point when we're reading parts of the New Testament in the light of the Old. We need to be as attuned to the differences as we are to the similarities. We need to be as attuned to the moments of fulfillment and the moments in which expectation is transformed or transcended. And so we can come to that, but I think that certainly applies to the discussion over John's prologue. We might go on to the apocryphal work Wisdom of Solomon. With you is wisdom, she who knows your works and was present when you made the world, she who understands what is pleasing in your sight and what is right according to your commandments. Send her forth from the holy heavens, and from the throne of your glory send her, that she may labour at my side, and that I may learn what is pleasing to you. For who has learned your counsel, unless you have given wisdom and sent your Holy Spirit from on high? And thus the paths of those on earth were set right, and people were taught what pleases you, and were saved by wisdom. And so there we've got references to wisdom, references to wisdom as a Holy Spirit. We've got references to the role of wisdom in labouring at the side of the king. There's a reference at the beginning to wisdom fully knowing the works of the Almighty, because she was present when the Almighty made the world. And so there are elements there. There are elements there which expand on this idea of wisdom that we've got in Proverbs. But you see there that that there is this idea that the wisdom of the Lord is somehow embedded in the cosmos. And somehow revealed in the commandments. And we might also, as a passage, invoke Psalm 19, which is 2 verses, one about the revelation of God in the natural world and one about the revelation of God in Torah. And the point of the psalmist and the point of these two writers in the Old Testament is that there isn't a disjunction between the revelation of God in the world and the revelation of God in Scripture. So much so, as we'll see in Baruch, that Scripture itself comes to be seen as the embodiment, the textual embodiment of the wisdom of God. So the idea is that you've got heavenly wisdom manifest in the cosmos, which becomes embodied as a text in the hands of Israel. So hear the commandments of life, O Israel, give ear and learn wisdom. Why is it, O Israel, that you are in the land of your enemies? So they're in the midst of their exile. Who has found wisdom's place? Sorry, I've jumped forward. You have forsaken the fountain of wisdom. If you'd walked in the way of God, you'd be living in peace forever. So the reason they're in exile is because they didn't do the right thing. So who has found wisdom's place, and who has entered her storehouses? Has anybody who's gone up to heaven and taken her? Who's brought her down from the clouds? Who's gone over the sea and found her, and will buy her for pure gold? No one knows the way to her, or is concerned about the path to her. But the one who knows all things knows her. This is the Lord. The Lord found her by his understanding, the one who prepared the earth for all time, filled it with four-footed creatures, the one who sends forth the light and it goes. References again to Genesis. Afterwards she appeared on earth and lived with humankind. She is the book of the commandments of God, the law that endures forever. And so there you've got a combination of the story of Israel in exile, the role of wisdom in relation to the created sphere, and then the role of wisdom as Torah, wisdom in textuate, and I'm deliberately paralleling the idea incarnate there, so wisdom becoming text as opposed to the word becoming flesh. But you've got wisdom becoming text, living specifically among the people of Israel. Again, there's that interesting combination of Genesis, creation, Torah, salvation, all woven together around the person of wisdom. So let's have a quick look at Sirach 24. And this, I think, is my favourite parallel for John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. For some reason, I haven't updated the title on this slide. It should say 1 to 18. Wisdom praises herself, and she tells of her glory in the midst of her people, in the assembly of the Most High. That means in heaven she opens her mouth, and in the presence of his hosts she tells of her glory. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. Do you hear the creation imagery there? The Holy Spirit hovered over the face of the waters. Yeah? I dwelt in the highest heavens, and my throne was in the pillar of cloud. Alone I compassed the vault of heaven, and traversed the depths of the abyss. Over the waves of the sea, over all the earth, and over every people and nation I have held sway. Among all of these I sought a resting place. In whose territory should I abide? Then the Creator of all things gave me a command. My Creator chose the place for my tent. He said, make your dwelling in Jacob, and in Israel receive your inheritance. Now at this point, if we were reading this passage in Greek, we'd notice that the verb make your dwelling and is skenoo, which means to pitch your tent in Jacob. Interestingly also, we'd notice in John that the verb skenoo is the word that's used in John chapter 1 verse 14. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us. It literally pitched his tent among us. And so I think that there's quite a strong case for thinking that John had this passage in mind, and that the idea of wisdom becoming a text and pitching its tent among the people of Jacob, which is a deliberate echo of the Exodus imagery and the tabernacle imagery of the Old Testament, that somehow John is evoking that when he's talking about the word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. And he does that quite subtly by simply using a similar verb. Well, actually the same verb. Anyway, let's go on. So before all of the ages, in the beginning, he created me. Now that's an interesting contrast with John. There's no reference in John to the Father creating the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And for all the ages I shall not cease to be. In the holy tent I ministered before him, and so was established in Zion. I took root in an honoured people. And then here I've just left this in because I think if we think that John perhaps had this passage in mind when he was writing the prologue, one of the things that will strike us is both the evocation and the contrast with some of the statements that Jesus makes about himself in the Gospel of John. Come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my fruits. Those who eat of me will hunger for more, and those who drink of me will thirst for more. What's going on there? And there's an interesting contrast, I think, between wisdom and her appeal to the people of Israel and Jesus' appeal to the people of Israel, which is not come to me and drink and you'll thirst for more. It's come to me and drink and you'll have a well of water welling up within you so that you never thirst again. Or come to me and eat and you'll hunger for more. No, it's whoever eats the flesh of the Son of Man has life in him. So there's a really interesting, and will never hunger again. So there's a real evocation of Sirach, whilst also maintaining a contrast. There's similarity and dissimilarity, and part of reading John's background intelligently is paying attention to both the similarities and the differences. But again, like Sirach, like Baruch, all of this is the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us as an inheritance for the congregations of Jacob. Last text, and then we'll I'll put the screen off and we'll have a little chat. Here's one from the apocalyptic literature, and this is fascinating. Wisdom found no place where she might dwell. Then a dwelling place was assigned to her in the heavens. Wisdom went forth to make her dwelling place among the children of men, and she found no dwelling place. Wisdom returned to her place and took her seat among the angels. And unrighteousness went forth from her chambers. Whom she sought not, she found, and she dwelt with them. The contrast there is Enoch has a very radically different assessment of the faithfulness of those who received divine wisdom in the form of Torah. Enoch's opinion is that wisdom, in this case, divine wisdom, in obedience and faithfulness and right interpretation, gave up and went home, because none of the people that she came to would listen. And if we were to take that apocalyptically negative, dualistically negative assessment of what happened when wisdom came, and insert that into Sirach, I mean, there's a really interesting, if we used the Gospel of John language, the story of Sirach is the story of wisdom becoming a text and being received by her own people. The minority report that you get in Enoch is that wisdom wasn't. Some Jews believed that wisdom wasn't received by her own people. That actually she didn't find a dwelling place. Now, what's going on there? Well, it's just to say that John is very unlikely, given the extensive wisdom materials that we've looked at, and this is by far just a very small selection. John's very unlikely to have only a single text in mind. And so interestingly, not only is he contrasting wisdom becoming a text with the word, which is different, becoming flesh, but they receive different responses, or perhaps or depending on which text you contrast him with, you receive different responses. If you contrast John with Enoch, then wisdom wasn't received, and actually neither was the word. He came to his own, and his own people received him not. But to those that did receive him, to those he gave. If we contrasted John with Sirach, wisdom came to her own, and her own gladly received her, and she grew tall like a tree. There's a contrast there, depending on which, there might be a contrast there, depending on which passage you think John has in mind at any one moment. So we've talked about the significance of argument. We've talked about the significance of literary style. We've talked about the significance of background. All of these things are terribly, terribly important in John. But I'm going to take us back round to one more issue. And just before we move on to that, isn't it interesting when we look at the Gospel Prologue, that the Gospel Prologue, instead of concluding that all this is the book of the commandments of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us, you get the statement, the law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So John is evoking the wisdom tradition, both to borrow it and to contrast it. And that's one feature of the prologue that's terribly important for us to get. Wisdom for John may be a shadow in the Old Testament of which Jesus is the fulfillment, rather than straightforward identification. And I think that's important. I think that's important for us to recognise when we're reading the prologue. And why that's important is because if we don't recognise the difference, we can sometimes assert things about the word that are asserted in the Old Testament about wisdom, and assume that the two carry over. I mean, in the Old Testament, wisdom is described as a creature. The word is not. No reference to his creaturehood, which is a contrast. But anyway, let's one other thing that is important for interpreting any biblical passage that invokes ideas that were common at the time but not common now. I want to draw your attention to verses 12 and 13. Well, I'll read from 10 actually. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God. Children born, not of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. And there's a contrast there. We're supposed to see blood, the will of the flesh, and the will of man in column A. That's one way of describing being born. And then of God in the other column. And so there's a contrast. He gave power to become children of God, not born this way, but born that way. Not born of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man. In other words, the ordinary means of birth, but born of God. Now, at a very simple and straightforward level, that's just contrasting what some Christian theologians have called natural and supernatural birth, or generation and regeneration, we might want to call it. But I think there's more going on there than that, because the words blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man are typical ancient ways of describing what was understood to be the processes of gestation and begetting. So in the ancient world, reproduction was perceived as being an asymmetric partnership between men and women. Men planted the seed and women grew it. Men planted the seed and women grew it from blood, a drop of blood in the womb. And the seed combined with the matter of the blood grew into the baby, and the mother provided food and a warm, safe place. But the nature of the child was, in the ancient world, commonly, with a few exceptions, commonly understood to be inherited from the father. And so this contrast between being begotten of a man and growing in a womb in the ordinary way, or being begotten of God, I think that's a much richer comparison than natural and supernatural birth. It's rather to invoke the idea that those who receive the Messiah, who believe in his name, have are given the power to become children begotten of God. In other words, though they're given the power to become participants in the divine nature. The what is begotten in them at that moment is of divine origin. John returns to this in chapter 3. Spirit begets spirit. Flesh begets flesh. And I think that knowing a little bit about what ancients thought about generation helps us to get a handle, I think, on what John and some of the other early Christians thought about regeneration. It's almost and I think and I think that might seem like a slightly minor exegetical point, but actually there's a major theological emphasis there. I mean, what would it be? I mean, this is just a liturgical question, but what would it be if we took seriously at coming to faith and baptism in our liturgy the idea that we were quite literally begotten by something from outside of the cosmos? There's a real challenge there, I think, for us to get a sense of the depth and scale of John's assertion about the nature of the life which is begotten in those who believe in the Messiah. It's not something discovered, it's something that is begotten in, infused in, generated in. I want to talk very briefly, because I've overrun. Forgive me, this is a tendency of mine. But I want to talk very briefly about some of the ways in which the prologue sets the agenda for the rest of the Gospel. Because if the prologue of John is about something greater than wisdom, something divine rather than a mere creature, something greater than wisdom becoming more than a text, so the divine becoming human, so that those who believe might become participants in the divine nature. And I'm deliberately echoing Irenaeus and Athanasius and a whole host of the fathers who said, why did God become human? In order that humanity might become divine. If that is part of the intention of John's Gospel, then what that suggests is it suggests that the world is in need of quite radical salvation. John's assessment of cosmic evil, or the need for cosmic redemption, is quite dramatic. So much so that the redemption itself is something that has to be brought in from the outside. It's cosmic in scale, but it's brought in by a divine figure. And that sets the agenda, I think, for the rest of the gospel. Because of course what that then means is we've got a handle on which we can, a peg on which we can hang our idea of signs. Why does John not have hundreds and hundreds of miracles? In Mark there are loads of exorcisms, so many that that sometimes just given the heading, and he healed a whole load of people in this place. Why is it that John has Jesus only do 7 big signs? Maybe John is working on the basis that when you're talking about the divine being revealed within the fabric of this cosmos, through the fabric of human flesh, that what you're talking about is something which is more like an eruption or an invasion than it is than it is a whole series of discrete events, and so the signs themselves become almost like icons of what it is when divinity enters the fabric of a material cosmos. It's almost like they burst the fabric, which of course is one of the principal images for wine and new wine in some gospel traditions. But the point there is that the material fabric of the cosmos is almost bent out of shape and ruptured by the sheer immensity of divine presence in the person of Jesus. And that's why the signs happen almost in response to his presence rather than in response to his agency. And that might give us an indication of how the scale of the Christology in John's prologue is actually the peg on which the signs are hung. And that gives us some sort of indication of how the prologue might be crucial to the way in which John's Gospel hangs together. Anyway, I've talked for a lot longer than I thought I was going to talk for. Sometimes I say to my congregation, I didn't have time to write a short sermon, so you'll have to make do with a long one. I rather feel that that's happened today, so please forgive me. But I hope that you found the content stimulating, and I do hope that we will have an opportunity to talk about the texts that I've shown you today, and I'm going to put them on Moodle, and some of these issues on Wednesday when we meet. Anyway, take care. God bless.